Hello. Hello, I'm Bill Carroll, and I am an education and employment and training specialist. I work now at PLCCA, which is the Proviso Lighton Township Council on Community Action. I previously have worked as an assistant director at a TRIO program. I have taught at the collegiate level, and I was a graduate assistant and a teaching assistant. And so I've been asked a lot of questions by people who are considering going back to school to get graduate degrees, and I decided to make a video talking about things that could possibly help you if you are deciding to pursue grad school and would like to have someone else pay for it, which I highly recommend is having someone else pay for it as opposed to you figuring out how to pay for it yourself. So going after a graduate assistantship or teaching assistantship or a research assistantship, they are all somewhat similar, but they also have some significant differences. It is a chance to work while you are in school, which is a challenge. I can tell you from example that I'm sure anyone who's been through it can as well. So it's a chance to get a little bit of pay, sometimes very little bit of pay, because I've had a 25%, a 33 and a third percent, and a 50% assistantship. We'll get into the numbers later. The pay is better now, thankfully, than when I was doing it, but it's still not going to be great. So advantages: you get hands-on experience in the real world in your field of study when you have an assistantship. You get to make some connections, usually academic connections, but sometimes professional connections. Obviously, the financial part of it, you're not paying for tuition. You are getting a tuition and fee waiver, and then also a little bit of a stipend on top of it. Much of it still goes towards things like books and things like that, but it can definitely help you. Sometimes there's even a salary, but usually a stipend is associated. You get skills development. You're seen as more of a colleague. When I noticed that when I was in class and my instructors knew that I was myself a teaching assistant, not to say that they cut me slack exactly, because they didn't. In fact, they held my work to a very high standard because they expected more of me sometimes, but they also saw me in a slightly different light. And then, as I mentioned, you can sometimes find a mentor, somebody who will step in and say, let me look at your lesson plan, let me look at what you're doing here. Though the term assistantship is always thrown around, in the case of my teaching assistantship, I wasn't assisting in the sense of helping another instructor or a professor. It was my class. I designed it. It existed. I didn't create it. Shout out to all the people that taught Theater 263 at University of Illinois before I did, including my friend Greg Carr. But each time it was different. Greg was in the MFA acting program, so it reflected him more. It was more acting focused because I was in a Master of Arts program in dramaturgy, dramatic literature, history, theory, criticism, sort of literature, history, theory, criticism focused as opposed to acting focused. But let me get to the nuts and bolts of what you have to do if you want to be a research assistant, a teaching assistant, or of course a graduate assistant. Now, to some extent, graduate assistant can be used to describe in a generic way anyone who is in graduate school and receives any kind of assistantship. But for me, when I use the term GA or graduate assistant, it refers to a specific sort of helper role. And I think some people may know it primarily from sports, right? It's that place between being a student athlete and being a coach. Very often they're former student athletes in case of athletic departments. In the case of other departments like psychology, psychiatry, chemical engineering, etc., it could be a student that's coming up from the undergraduate ranks there, or someone who's applying for graduate school externally. In the case of my situation, I wasn't at Illinois before. I was coming in from Virginia. But let's walk through some of the advantages and disadvantages. The advantage, once again, is that the biggest one for me is you're not paying. I talked through all of those. The big disadvantage, well, one, you don't get more hours in a day. You still have 24 hours in a day. You still have your class work to do and a prep. And I'm going to apologize to any of my students. I'm sure to some extent it probably even showed when my workload had intensified as a student. It meant that my workload as a teacher, when I was teaching my class, suffered a little bit. It took me a little longer to turn papers around. It took me a little longer to sometimes pull together some of the projects that I wanted to undertake. And I guess maybe most importantly, at times I think my preparation for my lectures suffered. So I had to get better at time management. I was forced to get better at time management. There's a very competitive selection process. No matter what kind of assistantship you want, there's more people who want assistantships than there are available assistantships. if you haven't ever prepared, I mean, getting good grades is one part. But if you're a solid student, solid to excellent student, that's only the first barrier that you must overcome. Now you have to look at things you bring to the table beyond just grades, because lots of people have good grades. The rates of pay vary widely depending upon the thing that you're studying, your major, field of focus, the location, the specific program itself. But stipends range from modest, I was definitely on the modest end, to competitive in some of the hard sciences, and things like IT, some of the engineering fields, medical fields. Some of those assistantships actually pay a living wage. Shout out to those people who went into the hard sciences. So the difficulty of being awarded an assistantship, well, as I mentioned, limited availability, specific requirements. Some require you to have specific qualifications, skills, or experience to narrow the pool of eligible applicants. Now, research assistantships are usually more specific. There are no research assistantships in theater. Well, let me rephrase that. I shouldn't say are none. There are very few, and they are on the academic side of theater. So if you want to do what we call theater historiography, right, and you're one of those people that wants to, you sort of have a little bit of archaeology and a little bit of sociology in your background, and you want to bring theater into it, almost one of those design a degree kind of things, you may find a research assistantship, but you'll have to really hustle to find it. The advantage of having a research assistantship is you get research experience, academic research experience, like published academic research experience, which will help you if you decide to stay on the academic side, or if you decide to go into private sector, sorry. Those things look great on your resume. Once again, academic networking. That's so powerful because you're working so closely with other faculty members and researchers. Publication opportunities are, I should have opened with that. Publication opportunities are immensely important in the academic world, still rather important even if you go into private sector. And getting those credentials and enhancing those credentials are the things that position you to be successful. Flexible schedule. Now, research assistantships, because they often are not attached to having to teach a class that meets on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday, when you do your work, it's a little more flexible. Your work still has to be done, trust me, but you maybe don't have to have everything done by this date, this time, well, until you get closer to your presentation. So compared to teaching assistantships, right? And something else that I think matters is your limited autonomy. You have less control over your research or work projects compared to some others. So a research assistantship gives you a little more autonomy than, say, a teaching or a general graduate assistantship. So I also had a graduate assistantship working in the Office of Minority Student Affairs as what's called a retention counselor. And that was grant funded. So that was a subdivision of Student Support Services, and that comes from the TRIO grant. So I've worked for TRIO, though I wasn't really aware of it, many years ago, before I later worked as a TRIO advisor and later got promoted, and for the last couple of years prior to my most new position, was an assistant director of a TRIO program. And still, one of the great experiences of my life, getting to work with so many students and seeing them overcome all the challenges that came to them. Okay, what else matters? What else do you want to look for when you're deciding whether or not you want to pursue these kinds of things? You do want to make sure that you are ready for a competitive selection process. As I mentioned, the selection process is highly competitive. If you aren't a person that likes to compete, then maybe you'll just take out a loan. But if you are a person who's competitive in nature and you want to measure yourself against your peers, going after a graduate assistantship, research assistantship, or teaching assistantship is a great way to see where you stand. So the workload will depending upon project deadlines and your supervisor's expectations on the research side. The focus is more narrow generally. You generally have to have a very specific focus to get a research assistantship. So as my father used to joke, he had a PhD, eventually you learn more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing. Yeah, that's an academia joke. You can see why academia jokes don't tend to go so well in the real world. But you have limited exposure to other fields of study. The rates of pay vary, as I said, became all the things we said before about which field of study, which institution, which market, and once again, what do they value the work you're doing? So the last thing I will say, in research, they will look for some very specific types of research projects. So you're learning essentially how to pitch. because you're finding hopefully a mentor while you're still an undergraduate, whether it be here where you're going after your assistantship or someplace else, that will guide you to some extent in that place. But you do want to have a good idea of what they look for and how they evaluate this. The advantage of a teaching assistantship, simply to me, is if you want to get some experience in classroom management, student interaction, and lesson planning. I learned those things. Now, obviously, those things don't transmit to K through 12 as easily sometimes, because classroom management is like the third or fourth most important thing as a person who's at the collegiate level, where it could be, if you're with eighth graders or whatever, it's probably number one, but you learn all of those things. Professional development, your organizational leadership skills. Organizational skills, I cannot tell you how important. If I could go back in time and talk to my 21-and-a-half-year-old self when I was first starting to think about trying to pursue a graduate degree, I would tell myself, really delve deeply into organization and the power of it. I learned on the fly, the old joke about building the plane while you're in the air, in order to get so much better at that. Professional development, I already talked about. Enhancing your communication skills is super important. It is very much a career prep kind of thing if you think you might want to go into education or academia. If you end up doing something else in your life, it's still important, because so much of what I've learned, even though I've only taught for a little time in my entire, now 35 plus years of working, only a small time of that was spent in the classroom in the teaching capacity. But I've learned about teacher training. I've learned about, like I said, just general leadership communications. I think it's usually helpful. Disadvantage, obviously, I mentioned time commitment, how consuming it is balancing your own work, your own research, your own everything you do as a graduate student with what you're doing for your students. The workload intensity means holding office hours, grading papers, preparing your lecture. It's very demanding. There were times when I got very little sleep. I don't think I got more than 5 hours of sleep more than a handful of times in the entire time that I was in my graduate program. And to this day, I'm a person that doesn't sleep that much. I don't know if I can blame it on that or not. But once again, rates of pay vary widely. So I mentioned 25%, 33%, 50%. That comes, it's supposed to be how many hours. So a 25% assistantship is half of half, right? So if full time is 40 hours, a 50% assistantship should be 20 hours per week. It should be noted, I worked at least probably more than 20 hours per week for every level of assistantship I had. It just came down to how much money I got. And because a grant funded thing is often different from what happens, it comes directly from the coffers, from the budget of the school, you can do the exact same job, and I've done it, and get paid twice as much for doing the same job at another time. So in the summer, I switched from one grant to a different grant and got paid twice as much money to do the same class, to do the same everything. The world is an amazing place. But make sure you ask specific questions during your interview process about that. Am I guaranteed that once I've been assigned this level, 50%, 33%, whatever, that it will stay at that level? Are there things I can do to bolster it? Can I add to it? And yes, you can pursue more than one 25% assistantship, since theoretically you're only working 10 hours a week. But I wouldn't have been able to do it. Even though supposedly I only had 10 hours a week of work, I had 20 plus hours a week, no matter what kind of assistantship I had. It's a real bargain for the schools, I'm telling you that. But you are getting, a industry-focused experience, and it hopefully will let you know if you're doing the right thing. If I had discovered, a year into it that I hated doing what I was doing, I don't know what I would have done, but I guess I would have done something different. But I did. I loved it. I loved being a retention counselor. I loved being a teaching assistant. I loved being a graduate assistant, helping, both student athletes and then some, non-student, some students who were not athletes, in making the adjustment from being in high school to being in college. As a research assistant, once again, it's a chance to establish yourself as a colleague or future colleague with other people in your field, to go to conferences, to present at conferences. If I had to say maybe the most powerful thing you can do, if you get to go to a conference and present at that conference your work as a research assistant, even if it's part of somebody else's work, your name is still in there, right? It's incredibly powerful and important, especially if you do want to stay in that field once you've graduated. Teaching assistantships, once again, that was my favorite thing. I enjoyed being a graduate assistant, but I loved being a teaching assistant. I am still friends to this day with some of the people I taught in Theater 263. One of my students was a terrific football player named Brad Hopkins. You know, his son playing the NFL, Bryson Hopkins. That was exciting watching his fantastic career with the Oilers/Titans, and now watching his son play. I am still friends with some of my students, and I've seen some of them go on to extraordinary successes. So that's incredibly fulfilling. But the final thing, the choice eventually comes down to, one, what's available. Can you get a teaching assistantship? Can you get a research assistantship? Throw wide your net. Throw wide your net. Just like when you were applying to colleges, you should have a quote unquote safety, sort of aspirational and a base, right? A base of 3 to 5 schools you feel very confident you'll get into, and ask them right up front, are there any research assistantships or graduate assistantships or teaching assistants available in my field or a related field? Let me just mention this. It doesn't necessarily have to be exactly perfectly in alignment with your graduate program. Could I have been a teaching assistant for a history class? The answer is yes. Could I have been a teaching assistant for an English class? The answer is yes. I would have had to probably do a little more prep work, but not that much more. So you're not constrained automatically. It comes down to if they think that you can do it. When you interview with someone in the English department, they notice that you're in sociology, but you were in the English club in high school and in college. You published a literary magazine while you're in college. You have shown in your own personal writings that you have a great sense of an understanding of grammar and syntax. You can overcome some of those challenges. I almost forgot to mention that. I'm glad I remembered. So don't just constrain yourself to the exact, if you're a psychology student, but you also got straight A's in math and you took some extra math you didn't even need while you're in college, could you probably teach freshman math? Probably. So don't constrain yourself just to the thing that you're directly studying. So when you are preparing for this, do what you can to stretch your opportunities. This is going to be a holistic experience, right? A buzzword that people throw around, but when I say holistic, it means that you are stretching and growing yourself in not just professional development and organization and networking, but also you're going to have to take on a variety of different kinds of duties, and you're going to have to do them well if you want to be successful. So once again, work-life balance, knowing what you can and can't do, and pushing yourself, striving to be successful. Look for grants. Also apply for grants even if you're awarded an internship. Are there grants based on your talent or your writing? Are there grants based on your identity or something about your organizational influences? Are you in a fraternity, or were you in a fraternity, sorority? Some of them have grants or graduate fellowships. Apply for fellowships and grants as well. You will not, even in some of the more lucrative assistantships, you will not, obviously, it's unlikely that you will not at some point need more money. I'll put it that way. Now, once again, if you're in biomedical research, or if you're in biochem, or if you're in some computer engineering, your stipend is going to be much higher than mine was. I remember after taxes, I was making $339. This is many years ago, but $339.50 a month. When I had my 25% assistantship, it went slightly up with my 33 and double that for my 50%. But I had to learn budgeting, right? I should put that somewhere on the things I learned. But please let me know if you have any questions. Once again, my name is Bill Carroll. I'll be doing at least one of these a month. I'll call this something like Desperately Seeking Sunday for information about fields. Thank you and good day.